Hello, I'm Rod Dreher. I'm here with Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev. Vladika, in modern times, scholars have been on a quest for the historical Jesus. What is this historical Jesus? And tell us about this project.
Well, the historical Jesus project started in late 18th century when certain people started not only question the authority of the church, but also the authority of the Gospels. And they would argue that the Gospels presented a wrong Jesus, and that their task as historians would be to see what the real Jesus could look like. And they began to argue on the basis of the historical evidence on Jesus, and also on the basis of other facts, that actually Jesus was perhaps a revolutionary who wanted to liberate Jewish people from the Roman authorities, and that he was crucified because of this, and obviously he didn't perform any miracles, and that all this miraculous side of Christianity was what was later added.
Because they believed miracles could not happen.
Because they believed miracles could not happen. And also there was a theory which was created much later, already in the 20th century, that actually there were the communities which presented Jesus in the way which was suitable for their followers. For example, they said there was a so-called Matthean community, which was divided into different fractions, into different parties. And there were some who believed that Christians should follow the law of Moses, and there were some others who were more on the side of the pagans who didn't want to do anything with the law of Moses. And so for this congregation, apparently a certain Matthew created his gospel. And then they also said that we should look at the text of the Gospels. What was the initial nucleus? And for example, we have two different versions of the Beatitudes, one in the Gospel of Luke and another in the Gospel of Matthew. And they said, well, the Luke's version is much shorter, therefore it was probably the original. And Matthew's version is more expanded, therefore it was Matthew who expanded this initial version in order to better suit his divided community.
Well, what's wrong with this method, this historical critical method of examining the Bible?
Because it is based on imagination, it's not based on sources. We have the sources, which are the four Gospels. And then we have the imagination of the scholars. For example, there was the so-called Q source, which was even published. There is a critical edition of this Q source.
What's the Q source?
The letter Q comes from the German Quelle, which means the source. It is supposedly the common source which lies at the origin of the three synoptic Gospels, of Matthew, of Mark, and of Luke. And there are scholars who believed that there was such source, but that it was lost. So they recreated it on the basis of the material which is common for the three synoptic Gospels, but they cut everything which is not common, they cut many other things, and they presented a very basic story, which they said is the original source. But the problem with this source is that nobody discovered it. There is even a book which is called Excavating the Q Source. But when you excavate something, you either find it or you don't find it. They didn't find the source, so they created it.
But today people give so much authority to scientists, to scholars, and so forth. Do you think there's a danger for ordinary Christians to put too much faith in scholars, in biblical scholars?
Well, I think biblical scholarship is generally a very useful thing. And in many cases, it helps us understand the gospel. For example, we don't know much about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and we can compare what we know about them from the Gospels with what we know about them from, for example, Joseph Flavius. And this is an interesting exercise. And there are many other similar things which could be provided by the biblical scholarship. Also, the whole story of the gospel text is very interesting, because this text, originally it existed in the oral tradition, then it was put in writing, and then there was this whole manuscript tradition in which it survived. So for all these reasons, the biblical scholarship is very interesting and could be very useful. But when it enters into the essence of the gospel teaching and of the gospel text, and when scholars begin to argue what in the gospels was original and what was added later, what we should believe and what we should not believe, then we are on a very shaky ground.
Is it possible to do real biblical scholarship without having faith in Jesus Christ?
My personal opinion is that is not possible. And I also think that if you really want to understand Jesus Christ, who he was and what he taught, you have to believe in what he said. If you begin to question his authority, if you begin to look at the gospel text and say, you know, this perhaps is original, this perhaps is added by a certain community, then you miss the point. Because here you have the testimonies, you have texts, you have 4 different texts, which in a very powerful way correspond to one another and confirm one another in essence, while they may differ in some details. But if you try to imagine the source which never existed, then of course you are on a shaky ground.
Final question. If you were an ordinary Christian seeking to read sound biblical scholarship, contemporary biblical scholarship, how could you tell what's good from what's dangerous?
You have to develop a certain taste. And then, of course, if you start reading, you can clearly see that there are different camps among biblical scholars. There was, for example, the so-called Jesus Seminar in the United States.
We've heard about them.
Which was a group of, how to better phrase this, a group of very different people, of whom only some were scholars and others were not, and who voted about different passages of the Gospels, and by doing so they wanted to decide what is original and what is not original. So they voted for each phrase, and then they marked. There was blue color, there was red color, pink color, black color, and in this way they actually discovered and claimed that only perhaps 15% of the gospel text is original. But what sort of exercise is this?
Yeah, do people still take them seriously today?
Not many, but there are some.
Yeah. Well, Metropolitan Hilarion, thank you very much. Thank you for listening.